Thank you very much. Yeah, on the title picture, you can see the delegation of the Russian Orthodox Church holding the blue banners as banners of disagreement during the General Assembly of WCC last year in Karlsruhe. I also was present there, sitting exactly at this place where the photographer was taking the picture, being in the delegation of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And observing how delegation of the Russian Orthodox Church could win the audience in a certain sense, blocking any discussions about its justification of the Russian aggression of Ukraine. So I will start with prayers, and you probably know that prayers might be the most normative texts of the Orthodox Church, more important than catechisms or some confessions of faith. The prayers are the most profound theological content of the Orthodox Church. And here, I don't know if you see well, yeah, the letters are big enough, and the red I put for you to see better. That's a prayer. So I will go to next, and then I go back. On May 11th, 2023, a priest, Ioan Koval, a cleric from the St. Andrew Church of Lublin, Moscow, was tried in ecclesiastical court of the Moscow Diocese of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Christ the Savior Cathedral, better known as Pussy Riot Cathedral. The conflict was about the prayer for Holy Rus, which was first read by Patriarch Kirill of Moscow on September 25, a few days after the beginning of the military mobilization in Russia. In this prayer, there is not theological content. However, the content is purely political. In the beginning, Gundyaev speaks in the name of his own people, whom he describes as God's humble servants, and also points to the enemies, from which God of might and of our salvation shall save this people of Patriarch Kirill. The enemies are described as those who wish to fight and turned against the Holy Rus, wishing to divide and destroy the unity of her people. In the second sentence, Patriarch Kirill calls upon God to help the former and to grant the mighty victory against the latter. Here is arise, O God, to help thy people and give us victory by thy power. Father Koval, who was instructed by his ecclesiastical authorities to read this prayer during the Holy Liturgy, decided, while addressing to God, to change word victory to the word peace, and this provoked controversy. The incident was reported first by altar boy to the rector of the parish, then the rector of the parish reported Koval to the local bishop, and finally, on the 2nd February, Patriarch Kirill dismissed Koval from priestly ministry until a trial could be held. The hierarchy regarded his actions as manifestation of unruliness. A special disciplinary commission was established to conduct investigation, interviewing parishioners and collecting evidences. The court, presided over by Father Vladislav Tsipin, one of the main specialists on canon law in the Russian Orthodox Church, decreed that Koval should be defrocked for oath breaking, canon number 25 of the Holy Apostles. During the court hearings, however, Koval was interrogated concerning his political and theological views, as he recalls them himself. The trial lasted about 1 hour and a half. I expected it to remain within the framework of theological arguments, but they tried to provoke me into making political statements. Honestly, I couldn't understand why they wanted this, given that I was being tried for ecclesiastical oath breaking and not for political position. The only thing they forced out of me was that I was against the war. After that, they described to clarify if I was against this specific war and thus abandoned it, or if I'm against all wars, and thus a pacifist and heretic. These two options were suggested by Father Tsipin, the chairman of the court. No alternatives were given, and I was supposed to decide quickly. Finally, in the verdict of the court was announced to Koval, in which he was referred as pacifist and consequently an oath breaker. So pacifism is kind of officially considered to be heresy in the Russian Church. Koval was not among almost 300 of Russian Orthodox priests who signed in 2022 appeal of priests of the Russian Orthodox Church with the call for reconciliation and ending of war. But on the basis of Koval's case, one of the Russian fundamentalist groups, Благодатный Огонь, demanded from the hierarchy to consider defrocking of all signatories of the appeal of liberal clergy, which is vile and treacherous towards our motherland and the Russian army, because this appeal is a knife in the back of the Russian soldier who liberates the world from Nazism, as our fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers heroically did during the Great Patriotic War. In essence, this appeal is a call for Russian capitulation to the West. The trend develops in the framework of the Russian Church to consider pacifism of its own clerics as heretic, sinful, anti-patriotic, and moral disconduct, up to the strongest canonical measure, such as defrocking from the holy priesthood. As Father Koval recalls, he didn't expect such a reaction, that the whole system of the Russian Church will attack him, and himself he didn't view own position as a radical or heroic one. He was sure he is going in the mainstream of Orthodox theology and is safe in his endeavors of peace. But the reaction of the Russian Orthodox Church establishment to this small act has shown that his action was a prophetic act of martyria and even of apocalyptic character, discovering the warmongering background of the Russian Orthodox Church and its theological inclination. The Russian Orthodox Church diversified its discourse concerning the war in Ukraine for the domestic audience on the one hand and international ecumenical audience on the other hand. Even for the domestic audience, Patriarch Kirill, unlike other more pro-military and outspoken bishops, tried to avoid expressions of direct support to the Russian army in its invasion to Ukraine. The first prayer, which he mandated to be prayed in all the Orthodox churches under his jurisdiction on March 3rd March 2022, was titled "A Prayer for Restoration of Peace," with petition to establish in our hearts a spirit of brotherly love and peace forever. Among those people who are heirs of those baptized in the font of Holy Prince Vladimir, and whom Kirill himself described by a notion of Holy Rus. However, according to his vision expressed in the prayer, it is not one people of Holy Rus who attack other people of the Holy Rus, but unspecified foreign tribes desiring to be at war and to fight against the Holy Rus. Unspecified in the mentioned prayer, the foreign tribes received their characteristic in the sermon of Cheese Fair Sunday. World power, powerful world, powers that be, powers of the world of excess consumption and the world of quasi-freedom, that's who are attacking Ukraine today. And in this struggle of metaphysical meaning, Ukraine is fighting back to keep its own identity, which is threatened by the West and not by Russia, which rather stands on the side of the light, maintaining its fidelity to God's word up to sacrificing itself on the cross. So in other sermon of Alexander Nevsky day, Kirill also spoke about the West as always trying to dominate, to bring spiritual death, to change the code of identity of the country, and even comparing the Western invaders to the Eastern invaders, he said that West is worse because it always wanted the souls of people to be taken over, and a dangerous force that could radically affect the spiritual life of people. So one might think many people would say that it's in contradiction, all this support of the war is in contradiction with the basis of the social doctrine of the Russian Orthodox Church, as a document which was warmly received by Roman Catholics, by Protestant colleagues, which were under discussion since 2000, and as a sign of development, progressive development of the Russian Church towards the development of social doctrine. And you see, in reality, in the basis of the social doctrine, you can find everything. But if you read it systematically, consistently, you can see that. Yes, first, the war is considered in the doctrine of the Russian Orthodox Church as an evil. It's stated, it's really recognized that war is evil. And the Russian Orthodox Church, even international scale, and opposes propaganda of war and violence. And so that's the commitment that the Russian Orthodox Church is taking in the basis of the social doctrine. And you could find it very strong message by which you can even judge Patriarch himself and not this poor priest Ion Koval. But if you read it more carefully, you will find 5 types of war in the basics of social doctrine and social concept. So 2 wars, civil war and aggressive external war, are absolutely forbidden, prohibited in the text of the doctrine. Here you can see quotations that when the state when the state starts civil or aggressive external war, it is forbidden to the church to cooperate with such a state. And that's a very strong message in a chapter dedicated to the relationship between the state and church. So church is expected to go against the state, and it's not considered unpatriotic in this case. But there are other types of war described in different parts of it. It's also very interesting that different types of war are described in different chapters of document. For example, civil and aggressive war you can find only in not on the chapter on war and church, but in the chapter on relationship with the state. You can also find inter-ethnic conflict. And for inter-ethnic conflict, the Russian Orthodox Church proposes limited neutrality or defense of the victim. So when something like that happens, the church should not identify itself with any side of inter-ethnic conflict, but in a case when one ethnic group is attacked by another ethnic group and the second is the victim, the church should take the side of the victim when the aggression or injustice are evident. The 4th type of war, which is exactly in the part of on the chapter concerning the war and to which many people pay attention, is just war theory. So the just war is not welcome, but tolerated under certain conditions. So here you can see the quotations from the document, and security of the neighbors and restoration of trampled justice, which are to be considered as good motives for the war. And so the limits, the ethical limits of just war could be on the basis of motives. So motives must be noble. And also methods and attitudes to war prisoners and civilians. So if the war is conducted in a way to respect and love of people and without making war crimes, that war is tolerated. But it's not the last type of the war. The last type of the war, which is hidden, I would even say, in the document, it's a liberation war. It is blessed, sacralized, and obligatory. And soldiers who die in this war are equalized to saints. Here you can also see different quotations from the document. So I will not repeat. You can. I don't know if you see them all. The church gives blessings to take part in liberation war, and if you avoid dying in the honor and freedom of fatherland, you become criminal or slave. But if you die for the faith and for the fatherland and for the sovereign, the leader of your country, then you will be granted life and crown in heaven, or and so on. So people who die on the battlefield, are included in the community of holy martyrs and called intercessors before God. And it's not stated as a part of documents, only quotations of some saints. But as you see, Saint Cyril equal to the apostle. It's not Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. It's a famous Saint Cyril and Methodius. It's a very apocryphic, probably, this saying, because there are no reference to from where it's taken, but it's included in the document and works as a framework for the idea of liberation war. And you can see that this idea of liberation war is promoted by Patriarch Kirill. So in a sermon of the 15th weeks of Pentecost, the famous sermon about washing the sins of soldiers on the battlefield, maybe everyone heard about the sermon like this, but most interesting is that it is this sacrifice is also compared to sacrifice of Christ himself. So as Christ loved the world and gave his life for the world, so the love can be also expressed by giving your life on the battlefield. And about love, there is the idea of patriotism also in the basics of social concept, in which patriotism is considered to be one of the ways of fulfilling God's commandment of love to one's neighbor. And the primary form in which patriotism can be manifested, it's defending of his fatherland against an enemy. So that's from this you can understand that the church, I quote Patriarch Kirill, the church is aware that if someone driven by a sense of duty, the need to fulfill an oath, remains true to his calling and dies in the line of military duty, then he undoubtedly commits an act of tantamount to a sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for others, and therefore we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins that the person has committed. And this is not some innovation of Patriarch Kirill, but a direct consequence of the document, of church official document, basis of the social doctrine of the Russian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Kirill was even modest, speaking about washing away sins, because the basics of social concept does not hesitate to directly rank such warriors to holy martyrs and call them intercessors before God. Moreover, the comparison of the sacrifice of soldiers with the saving sacrifice of Christ himself for the life of the world on the basis of John 3:16 in the same sermon, God in his Son gives his human life for the sake of other people, for the sake of human race, which means that sacrifice is the highest manifestation of person's love for his neighbors. Sacrifice is the greatest manifestation of the best human qualities. We know that today many dying on the field of the internecine strife. Also have grounds to be found in the social concepts of the Russian Orthodox Church in the form of reference to the comparison by Christ himself of his love and sacrifice for mutual love between his disciples, to which he calls and which is no greater as if one lays down his life for his friends, which is in the social concept applies specifically to warriors and no one else. So only die, and that's how you can be Christian. So the idea of the liberation war as a resistance to imperialistic aspirations is indeed a part of an Orthodox tradition. Many Orthodox nations were involved in the liberation wars against empires or colonial powers, fighting for freedom. Among them, also such a recent example as Cyprus, where national leader Archbishop Makarios II, Archbishop and the first president of independent Cyprus, was supporting fighting for independence from colonial powers, including our armed insurgency. At the same time, a discourse of liberation, which include critique of political, economic, cultural hegemony of the West, critique of militarization and expansion of NATO, the idea of preserving own identity vis-à-vis norms imposed from the West, anti-colonial and anti-globalist discourse, in which that the discourse is primarily used by the Russian Church also in the ecumenical arena. And while for Ukrainians, Russian Orthodoxy discourse in support of the war appears to be part of imperialistic ideology, for the Christian circles in Latin America, Africa, or left Western Christian churches, this is anti-imperialistic discourse. So very often when the critique is directed to imperialism, it misses the point because the main argument is anti-imperialistic. And it takes also the problem with sanctions, which is, for those who don't recognize sanctions as a good method, called unilateral measures. So against unilateral measures and so on. So for many countries from anti-colonial and liberation theology background, that place, it's recognized by them as something very important and sounds similar to their own concerns. The second diversification of discourse is directed to right-winged of traditionalist groups, and this is discourse of traditional values in the midst of cultural wars. Here on the picture you see the book Moralist International. I advise to everyone to read this book by Dmitry Uzlaner and Kristina Stöckl about Russian Orthodox Church involvement in different coalitions and alliances for traditional values. So that agenda includes anti-LGBT references, and that reference you also can see So the Russian Orthodox Church presents itself as a defender of traditional values in the context of cultural wars. This process in general is well described in this recent book. For the audience, the Russian Orthodox Church speaks and deploys the agenda of gay prides in Donbass and positions itself as a defender and last bastion of traditional values. For this right sector of Christianity, violence and hierarchies are among important elements of identity, so they do not share pacifist idea and might also support the Russian war. And so the war itself is not something unacceptable for this part of Christianity. So that's second type of discourse, which seemed to be completely in opposition with the previous one, but it still is used for. And the third is a discourse of pacifism. So the discourse of pacifism, for example, in Easter message, Patriarch Kirill says that we need a lasting and just peace to the brotherly people that come from one Dnepr baptismal font. In this discussion with Justin Welby, he also says that we need to defend every person's right and we need to achieve a lasting peace based on justice. With Pope Francis, he also speaks about soonest achievement of just peace and also on humanitarian aspects of recent WCC delegation visit to Russia. Also, the peace building was a core discussion during this meeting. Human rights and freedom of religion or belief was also very important, had an important role, and humanitarian help. This just peace framework, and I will finish here. So this pacifism is one more theological idea which is exploited in the ecumenical arena. And finally, works for denial of the right of Ukraine for self-defense. As Ukrainian theologian Lydia Lozova admits, when the same close to pacifist rhetoric of nonviolence and peace with very little attention to the question of defense is addressed to the reality of Ukraine now, to me and to many Ukrainians, it feels somewhat uncomfortable and even painful. Do we think that it is dubious today for Ukraine to pray not only for peace, but also for victory, not a conquering and triumphalist one, but one that would stop Russian genocide? Now I come back to the case of Father Koval. So for Father Koval, who changed in his prayer victory to peace, it was a prophetic voice, but from another context, from context of Ukraine, the same thing doesn't work anymore, because I also would advise, there is a new article of theologian, also Ukrainian theologian, Greek Catholic theologian Pavlo Smitsnyuk, who tries to see how the Roman Catholic Church is addressing the context of the war in Ukraine, and how the just war theory and non-violence, how this imbalance is happening, in how the prophetic and in some sense utopian and eschatological idea of peace comes into contrast and sometimes is used against of the basic right of self-defense of victim. So I also advise you to read. And I know we will have also a paper which we need to rethink the idea of just war, but I think we also need to rethink the idea of just peace in our theological work. And coming from my own context, from context of Belarus, the peace is very often used by the regime as a tool to make people be silent, and church is also using as a position of pacification. You know, you should not be disobedient, otherwise you're against peace. Yeah. So thank you very much, and.
Thank you very much, Natallia. We have time for only one question because I stick to the timetable and I'm very harsh. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Natallia. That was absolutely fascinating. I wanted to ask you about just one thing. So the question of liberation you referred to as something that the Russian Orthodox Church frames as its ideological agenda for the left, for the global South, let's say, as well. It just strikes me. How do you frame a war of aggression as a liberation? Because I can hear that they try to present it as such to the world, but how can you frame your aggressive war on another country as a liberation war? I mean, I just don't get the essence of this. How can they do that?
So it's very easy. You just go to another level. So you don't. You're not imperialist who try to conquer smaller country, your neighbor country, by using some ideological or military power. But you try to liberate. But that's also a typical argument. It's which often is used in the aggressive wars to present as a defenders of these people and being the voice of these people against the West, which tries to and by the way, all discussions now with proliferation of weapons and NATO supporting Ukraine plays in a certain sense for strengthening this idea that you see we are fighting not with Ukraine, we are fighting for Ukraine against the West, which tries to colonize it, which tries to impose its own values on it, and so on. And I must say that it is very how human rights agenda can be used in this context, but it is used. Human rights, freedom of religion or belief, and so on.
Okay, once more, thank you very much, and yeah.